Before car seats, before safety labels, before anyone thought twice about giving a baby literal morphine to stop crying, parents were out here letting doctors inject their toddlers with opium and calling it a Tuesday. We found 111 real inventions, real products, and real expert advice from history that will make you question how any of us survived childhood at all. And number 57 alone will make your jaw hit the floor. If this is blowing your mind already, smash that hype button below, and let's see how hyped the internet gets about babies surviving the most unhinged era in childcare history. 1. Back in 1930s London, parents were actually bolting iron mesh cages outside their apartment windows and stuffing their babies inside them. Yes, 6 stories above the ground. Doctors and child experts were out here genuinely recommending this as fresh air therapy for infants. Mothers would strap their babies into these wire boxes like they were storing leftovers on a windowsill. No net, no padding, just pure open air and a long way down. 2. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup was the hottest parenting product of the Victorian era, and every exhausted mother swore by it. The secret ingredient? Morphine sulfate. Doctors recommended it. Pharmacies stocked it proudly. Parents poured it into their screaming babies without a single second thought because the label said soothing. And that was good enough. Thousands of infants never woke up from that soothing. The product stayed on shelves for decades before anyone decided that maybe morphine and babies was a bad combination. 3. Lead paint on wooden toys was completely normal and nobody blinked an eye. American toy manufacturers were slapping bright, colorful, lead-based paint on every block, train, and figure they made because it looked great and lasted long. Children did what children do and chewed everything in sight. The paint chipped, the kids swallowed it, and parents just wiped their hands and moved on. The United States did not ban lead paint on toys until 1978, which means generations of kids were basically snacking on poison daily. 4. In the 1800s, someone invented a baby feeding bottle with an 18-inch rubber tube attached to it, and parents thought it was revolutionary. The idea was simple: prop the bottle up and let the baby feed itself. And the problem was that rubber tube was nearly impossible to clean, and bacteria absolutely loved living inside it. Parents reused these bottles for weeks without proper washing. Doctors eventually started calling it the murder bottle, which is about the least subtle product warning in human history. 5. Newborn babies in the 1800s were getting wrapped in tight cloth binders around their entire torsos the moment they came out of the womb. Doctors called it spine support, and parents followed orders without question. These corset-style binders squeezed infant chests so tightly that breathing became genuinely difficult for babies who had just learned to breathe 5 minutes ago. It was considered proper newborn care across Europe and America for decades before someone finally noticed the babies looked uncomfortable and slightly blue. 6. Wheeled baby walkers have been around forever, but nobody thought to check what happens when a rolling baby with zero steering ability meets a staircase. Thousands of American children every single year went flying downstairs inside these plastic contraptions at full speed. Emergency rooms were seeing walker stair injuries constantly. Canada got so fed up they banned baby walkers entirely in 2004 and made it illegal to even sell one. The United States looked at the same injury data and decided to just add a warning sticker instead. 7. For most of American history, changing tables had no safety straps whatsoever, and manufacturers saw absolutely nothing wrong with that. Parents were placing squirming, wiggling babies on narrow, elevated tables, with nothing to stop them from rolling straight off the edge. A fall from changing table height onto a hard floor causes serious skull fractures in infants. This was happening regularly in homes across the country. Safety straps only became a standard feature in the 1980s, which means decades of babies were one distraction away from disaster. 8. Lawn darts seemed like a completely reasonable backyard game until you remember they were basically metal spears designed to be thrown through the air by children. Jarts, as they were called, had heavy-weighted metal tips that could drive straight into the ground with serious force. 4 American children were killed, and thousands more were injured before the Consumer Product Safety Commission finally banned them in 1988. One father whose daughter was killed campaigned for years to get them pulled. The company argued people just needed to be more careful. 9. Baby bath seats with suction cups were marketed to American parents as the perfect solution for bathing infants safely and independently. The seat would suction to the tub bottom and hold the baby upright while the parent stepped away for just 1 second. Except those suction cups released without warning on wet surfaces, which is exactly what a bathtub is. Babies tipped forward face down into the water with no way to right themselves. Parents who thought the seat meant their baby was safe came back to a horrifying situation. 10. In the 1920s and 1930s, doctors across America started prescribing ultraviolet sun lamp sessions for babies to help them produce vitamin D. Parents would sit their infants under these glowing UV lamps in the living room, like they were tanning at a tiny baby resort. No goggles, no time limits. No protection of any kind. The lamps burned infant skin and caused serious radiation damage to their eyes. Physicians wrote these prescriptions with complete confidence because the science of radiation safety was apparently still a work in progress. 11. In the 1940s and 1950s, American shoe stores had a machine that let children stick their feet inside and watch their own bones on a live X-ray screen while a salesman checked the fit. Parents thought this was the coolest technology they had ever seen. Kids were pressing their faces against the viewer and blasting their feet with radiation for fun while waiting for mom to pay. Nobody set any dose limits. Nobody tracked how many times a child visited. Shoe shopping was just casually irradiating an entire generation of American children. 12. Through most of the 1970s, American parents were placing newborn babies in forward-facing car seats and calling it a day. The seats existed, which felt like enough. Crash test data eventually revealed that in a frontal collision, a forward-facing infant's neck snaps forward with catastrophic force because a baby's head is enormous compared to its body. Rear-facing positions had dramatically better survival outcomes, and the evidence was sitting in research labs for years before anyone made it standard advice. Fashion over physics was apparently the guiding principle of American car safety. 13. Giant metal merry-go-rounds were a staple of every American school playground, and the entire point was to spin them as fast as humanly possible. Ace bigger kids would get it going at full speed and then jump on while smaller children held on for their lives. There were no grip rails worth mentioning. There was no speed-limiting mechanism of any kind. Children flew off regularly and hit the ground hard. The merry-go-round would keep spinning and immediately threaten to hit them again. Schools kept these things on playgrounds for decades without a second thought. 14. For centuries across multiple cultures, the solution to a wiggly newborn baby was to simply strap them completely motionless to a flat wooden board. Papoose restraint boards immobilized infants from shoulders to feet, with every limb pinned down for months at a time. Parents were told this would help the baby develop properly and grow straight. And what it actually did was restrict all natural movement during the most critical period of physical development. Babies strapped to boards for months missed crucial muscle building and joint development that their little bodies desperately needed to be doing. 15. In 2012, a product called the Infant Advantage car bed was being sold to American parents as a safe travel solution for newborns. Instead of a traditional car seat, the baby laid completely flat inside a padded bed that strapped into the vehicle. It sounded gentle and comfortable, which is probably why parents bought it. The structural design was fatally flawed, and the bed could shift and compress during travel, creating a suffocation risk for the infant lying inside. It took actual infant deaths before the product was pulled from shelves and recalled. 16. Our drop-side cribs were one of the most popular nursery products in American homes for decades. The movable side rail was supposed to make it easier for parents to lift their baby in and out without straining their backs. What nobody caught was that the drop-side mechanism could malfunction and partially collapse in the middle of the night. The gap created between the mattress and the falling rail was exactly the wrong size and trapped infants in positions they could not escape. Over 30 babies suffocated this way before the United States banned drop-side cribs entirely in 2011. 17. Godfrey's Cordial was an 18th century British product that flew off pharmacy shelves as the go-to cure for colicky crying babies. The active ingredient was opium mixed with treacle to make it sweet enough for a newborn to swallow without fussing. And parents gave it freely. Doctors recommended it without hesitation. Newborns who received regular doses became quiet very quickly, which everyone assumed meant the colic was improving. Many of those babies were simply sedated into dangerous unconsciousness. The product was wildly popular for generations because a quiet baby felt like a problem solved. 18. Victorian nurseries across England and America were decorated in a beautiful deep green that was considered the height of stylish interior design. That green came from arsenic-based dye, and it was in the wallpaper of the rooms where infants slept every single night. When the wallpaper aged and began peeling, it released toxic arsenic dust directly into the air of the nursery. Babies breathed it constantly. Parents noticed their children seemed sickly, but blamed bad air and weak constitutions rather than the beautifully decorated walls surrounding them. Nobody connected the fashionable wallpaper to the suffering children underneath it. 19. In the early 1900s, sweetened condensed milk was being actively marketed to American and European mothers as a modern, sophisticated alternative to breastfeeding. It had almost no nutritional value for a growing infant and contained virtually no fat or protein in the ratios a baby actually needed. Infants fed exclusively on sweetened condensed milk developed severe malnutrition and scurvy at alarming rates. Doctors were seeing these cases constantly, but the product kept selling because the advertising was confident and mothers trusted the label. The babies paid the price for some very aggressive early 20th century marketing. 20. Victorian-era christening gowns were a point of enormous family pride, and the longer and more elaborately laced the gown, the better. Some of these garments stretched 6 full feet in length on a baby that was maybe 20 inches long. The excess fabric trailed dramatically behind during the ceremony and looked absolutely stunning in portraits. It also caught in carriage wheels during transport and draped directly over open fireplace grates when families gathered indoors. Infants were seriously injured and killed by their own ceremonial clothing, while their families stood nearby admiring how beautiful they looked. 21. The Jolly Jumper has been around since 1910, and parents have always loved watching their babies bounce around in it like a tiny, excited kangaroo. The original version had absolutely no weight limits, no age guidelines, and no safety standards of any kind attached to it. Babies were being placed in these jumpers far too early before their hips had developed enough to handle the position and the pressure. Hip dysplasia cases linked to early jumper use were showing up in pediatric offices regularly. The product just kept selling because bouncing babies looked happy, and happy-looking babies meant everything was fine. 22. High chairs in the 19th and early 20th century were designed with wide openings between the tray and the seat that seemed perfectly harmless to everyone involved in making them. What actually happened was that small infants would slip downward through that gap feet first and become trapped with the tray pressing against their neck. Children hanged themselves in their own high chairs while sitting at the family dinner table. This was not a rare, isolated incident. It happened repeatedly across America and Europe, and manufacturers continued producing the same design because nobody had written a law, yet saying they had to change it. 23. In 1950, a company called Gilbert released the U-238 Atomic Energy Lab and marketed it directly to American children as the most exciting educational toy ever made. Inside the kit were actual samples of radioactive uranium ore that kids could handle, experiment with, and examine up close. The set came with a Geiger counter so children could measure the radiation they were personally being exposed to, which was apparently considered part of the fun. Parents bought this for Christmas gifts. Teachers recommended it for curious students. It stayed on the market for 2 years before someone decided uranium and children was not a winning combination. 24. Electric bathwater heaters in the early 20th century were exactly what they sound like. A plug-in electrical heating element that you place directly into the bathwater to warm it up before putting your baby inside. The device ran on standard household current with no ground fault protection, no circuit breaker, and no waterproofing worth mentioning. One malfunction, one slipped wire, and one moment of contact between the electrical element and the water meant instant electrocution. Parents used these routinely because hot water from a tap was not always guaranteed, and a warm bath for the baby felt like responsible parenting. 25. Playpens through the 1970s and 1980s were made with PVC vinyl-coated rails that looked clean, colorful, and completely safe to every parent who bought one. What was leaching out of that vinyl coating were phthalate plasticizers, chemicals used to keep the plastic flexible and soft. Infants did what infants do and chewed on those rails constantly for months at a time. The plasticizers absorbing into their bodies during all that chewing were linked to hormonal disruption and developmental issues. Parents had no idea because the playpen looked perfectly fine and nobody on the label mentioned the chemical situation happening inside the plastic. 26. In the 1920s, the word radium was basically synonymous with health, energy, and modern science. And marketers knew exactly how to use that. Baby blankets and infant health products were being sold across America with radium listed as an active beneficial ingredient. Parents bought radium-infused products for their babies the same way people today buy vitamin supplements, with complete trust in whatever the label claimed. Radium causes radiation poisoning, bone decay, and cancer with prolonged exposure. The babies wrapped in these blankets were being irradiated nightly while their parents felt proud for investing in such advanced modern childcare products. 27. Until 1985, not a single American state had a law requiring children to ride in car seats, and the results were exactly as catastrophic as you would expect. Children rode completely loose in back seats, bouncing around like luggage on every turn and stop. Toddlers sat on their mothers' laps in the front seat with no belt. Babies were held in arms during highway driving. A sudden stop at 30 miles per hour sent an unrestrained child straight into the dashboard or windshield. Pediatricians were raising alarms for years, but the cultural attitude was that people had always driven this way and turned out fine. 28. Metal playground slides were a fixture of every American park and schoolyard through most of the 20th century, and nobody thought to check what temperature bare metal reaches after sitting in direct July sunlight for several hours. The answer is approximately 160 degrees Fahrenheit, which is more than enough to cause third-degree burns on contact. Children in shorts and swimsuits were sitting down on these slides and burning the backs of their legs severely before they even reached the bottom. Parents watching from the bench had no idea why their child was suddenly screaming on the way down. 29. Victorian-era high chairs were built with a feature that modern parents would find absolutely unbelievable, and that was leather ankle straps bolted to the footrest. The straps were designed to keep the baby perfectly still during feeding time, because a wiggling child was considered improper and inconvenient. Parents buckled their infants in by the ankles like tiny prisoners at the dinner table, and considered this completely reasonable childcare. The straps restricted circulation, caused pressure on developing ankle joints, and gave the baby absolutely no ability to shift position during what could be a very long Victorian family meal. 30. The Bumbo baby seat came with an extremely appealing pitch, which was that your infant could sit upright and independently before they had the muscle development to actually do that on their own. Parents loved it and immediately started placing the seat on kitchen counters, tables, and elevated surfaces for convenience. The Bumbo had no safety strap, and babies leaned, rocked, and toppled off counters from significant heights onto hard floors. Skull fractures in infants were being reported. The company recalled the product in 2012, and the fix was a sticker on the box that said, "Do not use on elevated surfaces," which was helpful to nobody. 31. Cribs throughout most of American history were built with bar spacing that nobody had actually measured against the size of a baby's head, and the results were predictably terrible. The gaps between the bars were wide enough for an infant to push their head through while sleeping, and then completely unable to pull it back out. Babies became entrapped in their own cribs in the middle of the night with their heads locked between bars and their bodies dangling. This was a known recurring problem for decades before crib bar spacing became a regulated measurement with actual legal standards attached to it. 32. Steedman's soothing powders were one of the most trusted teething products in Victorian-era Britain and America, and mothers kept them in their medicine cabinets like a household staple. The active ingredient was calomel, which is mercury chloride, and it was being dissolved and given to teething infants on a regular basis. Mercury poisoning in babies presents as irritability, tremors, and peeling skin on the hands and feet, and doctors at the time called this condition pink disease without connecting it to the wildly popular mercury-based powder they were all recommending. The product stayed on shelves for generations. 33. In the 1950s, American parents were dressing their babies in pajamas that were specifically marketed as fireproof, and the fireproofing material was asbestos. Manufacturers genuinely believed this was a selling point, and parents genuinely agreed because fire safety for sleeping children seemed like a reasonable priority. What those babies were doing every single night was inhaling asbestos fibers while they slept in their cozy, supposedly safe pajamas. Asbestos causes mesothelioma and lung disease with a latency period of decades, meaning many of those children grew up with no idea what was slowly developing inside their lungs from their very first years of life. 34. And in the 1970s, Nestlé launched an aggressive marketing campaign in developing nations pushing their lactogen infant formula as the modern superior choice over breastfeeding. Representatives dressed as nurses visited hospitals and handed out free samples to new mothers. The campaign worked, and mothers switched to formula in enormous numbers. The critical problem was that in countries without reliable access to clean water, mothers were mixing formula with contaminated water and the infants were dying from diarrheal disease at devastating rates. Nestlé continued the campaign for years while the infant death toll climbed, and the controversy became one of the most infamous corporate scandals in food industry history. 35. Knit children's jackets with drawstrings around the neck were a completely standard clothing item sold in every American and European children's store for decades, and nobody flagged them as dangerous until children started dying on playgrounds. The drawstring would catch on playground equipment, on protruding bolts, on fence posts, and the child would drop or jump, and the string would pull tight around their neck instantly. It happened fast and it happened without warning. The European Union finally banned drawstrings on the neck and hood area of children's clothing in 2011. The United States issued voluntary guidelines which manufacturers were free to ignore entirely. 36. Victorian perambulators were beautiful, elaborate, well-crafted carriages that wealthy families pushed proudly through parks and streets across Britain and America. They had springs, canopies, decorative ironwork, and absolutely no harness or restraint system of any kind inside them. The baby simply sat or lay in the carriage, held in place by nothing except the laws of physics and the smoothness of the road. Cobblestone streets provided neither of those things reliably. Infants tumbled out of their elegant carriages onto stone streets during routine afternoon walks, and the solution from pram manufacturers was simply to suggest that parents push more carefully. 37. Foldable high chairs became enormously popular with American families in the latter half of the 20th century because they were convenient, portable, and could be collapsed flat for storage in seconds. The collapse mechanism involved hinged joints that folded under significant spring tension, and those joints had no guards, no shields, and no protective covers over the pinch points. Parents folding the chair after a meal regularly caught their own fingers in the mechanism. Children playing near the chair while a parent folded it caught their fingers and toes in the same joints. Fingernail avulsions and crush injuries were common enough that multiple manufacturers faced lawsuits before redesigns happened. 38. The Austin Magic Pistol was a 1950s toy gun sold to American children that operated by combining calcium carbide pellets with water inside the chamber to produce acetylene gas, which was then ignited to fire a plastic ball with a genuine explosive bang. This was a toy, sold to children, in stores. The gun produced real combustion, real pressure, and real explosive force with every single shot. Burns from misfires were reported regularly. The toy required children to handle calcium carbide, which reacts violently with moisture and produces flammable gas. It was marketed as magical and fun rather than what it actually was, which was a small working explosive device. 39. Tin bathtubs for infants in the 19th and early 20th century were manufactured by stamping flat sheets of metal into a tub shape, and the stamping process left edges that were sharp enough to cut skin cleanly. No grinding process was required by law. No smoothing of the rim was considered standard practice. Parents filled these tubs with water and placed their naked infants inside them directly against those unfinished metal edges. Cuts on infant skin from the tub rim during bathing were considered a minor inconvenience rather than a product defect. The idea that a baby bathtub should not have sharp edges was apparently not obvious to anyone involved in making them. 40. Baby walkers in the 20th century were designed with wheels for indoor use on flat floors, and nobody thought seriously about what would happen if one ended up on a sloped surface outdoors. Parents let their babies roll around in walkers on patios, driveways, and sloped backyard surfaces because the babies seemed to enjoy the freedom and movement. Walkers had no brakes, no steering, and no stopping mechanism whatsoever. On any kind of incline, the walker simply accelerated in whatever direction Grav 41. Mercury glass thermometers were the standard tool for taking a baby's temperature for most of the 20th century, and the recommended method for infants was rectal insertion, which required placing a thin, fragile glass tube filled with liquid mercury inside a squirming newborn. Babies moved. Glass broke. Mercury was introduced directly into body cavities of infants during routine temperature checks in family homes across America. Pediatricians knew glass thermometers broke occasionally and considered it an acceptable risk of standard medical practice. The idea that maybe a fragile mercury-filled glass tube was not the ideal instrument for use inside a newborn was slow to gain traction. 42. On most international flights today, an infant under 2 years old can fly as a lap child, meaning the baby is held in the arms of a parent with no seatbelt, no car seat, and no restraint of any kind during the flight. Aviation safety experts have been pointing out for decades that in any serious turbulence event or crash scenario, a lap-held infant becomes an uncontrolled projectile moving at the speed of the aircraft. Parents assume their arms are strong enough to hold a baby through any impact. Physics disagrees completely. The lap infant policy exists primarily because airlines know families will not pay for an extra seat, and regulators have not forced the issue. 43. Why spring riders shaped like animals were a beloved fixture of American playgrounds and parks through the latter half of the 20th century. And the design was simple: a metal animal head on a heavy spring base that children sat on and rocked back and forth. The footrests on many models were either non-existent or completely inadequate, meaning children's feet hung freely and dragged on the ground during enthusiastic rocking. At sufficient speed, the dragging feet experienced serious friction burns, and in cases where a foot caught on uneven ground, the force was enough to cause fractures. The spring rider looked cheerful and harmless, which is why it stayed on playgrounds so long. 44. In 19th century Britain and America, wealthy families employed nannies to manage their infants and children around the clock, and those nannies had their own very efficient solution for keeping babies quiet during the night, so everyone could get some rest. Laudanum was an opium tincture widely available at any pharmacy, and nannies administered it to infants without telling the parents, without measuring doses carefully, and without any medical oversight whatsoever. Parents woke up to unusually quiet, deeply sedated babies and assumed the nanny was simply gifted with children. Some of those babies did not wake up at all, and the nanny quietly moved on to the next household. 45. The nap nanny was an inclined infant recliner that looked incredibly comfortable and was marketed to exhausted American parents as a solution for babies who struggled to sleep flat. The seat held the baby at an angle which seemed gentle and supportive. What the inclined position actually did for infants without sufficient neck and core muscle control was allow their heads to drop forward slowly until their chin pressed against their chest and their airway became compromised. 5 infants died from positional asphyxia in the nap nanny before the Consumer Product Safety Commission recalled it in 2012. The company initially fought the recall and disputed the findings rather than pulling the product immediately. 46. For centuries across Europe and America, the standard infant mattress was stuffed with feathers because feathers were soft, widely available, and felt luxurious under a sleeping baby. The problem with a feather mattress is that it responds to weight and pressure by molding itself around whatever is placed on top of it. An infant who rolls or shifts face down into a feather mattress creates a perfect seal around their nose and mouth. The mattress conforms to their face, and the baby cannot generate enough strength to push away from it. This was happening in homes for generations and was routinely listed as unknown causes on infant death records because nobody understood why healthy babies were dying in their sleep. 47. Batley's Drops was an English pharmaceutical product from the 1800s that contained a solution that was approximately 99% opium and was sold openly in pharmacies as a perfectly appropriate infant sedative for fussy or colicky babies. Parents measured it out and gave it to newborns. The dosing instructions were vague enough that overdose was almost casual. Infants who received Batley's drops went quiet almost immediately, which reinforced to parents that the product was working beautifully. The drops were so popular and so trusted that chemists kept them in stock for decades, and doctors referenced them in published medical literature without flagging the obvious problem with giving near-pure opium to a newborn. 48. Seen in 2010, American health officials were still finding cadmium in children's jewelry being sold in the major retail stores across the country. Cadmium is a toxic heavy metal that causes kidney damage and is classified as a known human carcinogen. It had been used as a cheap substitute for lead in jewelry manufacturing after lead restrictions tightened and manufacturers simply switched to an equally toxic alternative without telling anyone. Children were wearing these bracelets and necklaces daily, chewing on them the way children always chew on things, and absorbing cadmium directly. The jewelry was bright, colorful, affordable, and available everywhere, which is exactly why millions of pieces sold before testing revealed what was actually in them. 49. But honey pacifiers were sold as a natural soothing product for teething and fussy infants, and the logic seemed reasonable because honey is sweet, and babies respond well to sweetness. What honey also contains is Clostridium botulinum spores, which are completely harmless to adults and older children whose digestive systems can neutralize them without any trouble. An infant's digestive system cannot do this. The spores germinate inside the baby's gut and produce botulinum toxin, which causes infant botulism, a condition involving progressive muscle weakness, difficulty breathing, and potential respiratory failure. Parents buying honey pacifiers from pharmacy shelves had no reason to suspect that a natural sweet product could cause paralysis in their baby. 50. Org's flannel cotton nightgowns were the standard sleepwear for American and European children for most of recorded history, and untreated cotton flannel is one of the most flammable fabrics that exists. A child in a flannel nightgown who came within range of a candle, a fireplace, or an open gas lamp did not have much time before the fabric caught and spread flame across the entire garment in seconds. Thousands of children died from nightgown fires annually before flame-retardant fabric laws were introduced. The tragedy repeated itself in homes everywhere every single year, and the cultural response for generations was grief, rather than the obvious realization that the fabric itself was the problem. It chose. Children rolled into swimming pools, off patio edges, and into driveways in moving traffic before anyone thought to address the fundamental flaw of a wheeled baby vehicle with no way to stop. 51. Wicker prams were the fashionable choice for Victorian and Edwardian mothers, pushing their babies through parks and city streets, and they looked absolutely charming in every photograph taken of them. What they provided in style, they completely failed to provide in protection. The wicker construction had no weatherproofing, no rain cover, no sunshade, and no insulation against cold temperatures. Infants lay inside exposed to whatever the sky decided to do that day for hours at a time while mothers socialized and promenaded. Babies were soaked in rain, burned by direct summer sun, and chilled in cold wind during what everyone considered a perfectly normal and healthy outdoor outing for the child. 52. Dressers and wardrobes in American homes were tall, heavy, freestanding furniture pieces that sat completely unanchored against walls for most of the 20th century, and nobody considered this a safety issue until the data became impossible to ignore. A child climbing the drawers like a ladder, which children do instinctively and constantly, shifted the center of gravity of a 200-pound piece of furniture forward until it tipped and fell. A child every 2 weeks was being killed by falling furniture in the United States. Wall anchoring kits existed and cost almost nothing. Widespread safety advice about anchoring furniture to walls only became standard pediatric guidance after the year 2000. 53. Chemistry sets in the 1950s were one of the most popular gifts American parents bought for curious children, and the sets were genuinely stocked with real chemicals that could do real things, including real damage. Sulfuric acid was included in some kits. Sodium was included. Potassium permanganate was included. These were not toy versions of chemicals, they were actual, laboratory-grade substances packaged in cardboard boxes with colorful rockets on the cover. No protective goggles were included. No gloves were provided. The instruction booklets described experiments involving open flames and volatile reactions, And the target audience was a 10-year-old working alone in the kitchen while parents watched television in the next room. 54. Backyard swimming pools became a symbol of American suburban success in the 1950s and 1960s, and families installed them by the millions without any legal requirement to fence them off from the rest of the yard. A toddler left unsupervised in a backyard with an unfenced pool had a direct, unobstructed path to the water at all times. Drowning is silent, fast, and invisible from inside the house. Children were dying in their own backyards in pools their families had bought for summer fun. Most American states did not introduce pool fencing requirements until the late 1970s, and even then enforcement was inconsistent enough that unfenced pools remained common for years afterward. 55. In the 1930s through the 1950s, ultraviolet sun lamps were prescribed by American and British doctors as a treatment for rickets in infants who were not getting enough natural sunlight during winter months. The lamp would be set up in the living room and the baby would be placed under it for prescribed sessions, meant to stimulate vitamin D production through the skin. Nobody provided eye protection for the infants during these sessions. Ultraviolet radiation causes severe corneal burns with relatively brief unprotected exposure. Babies who received regular lamp sessions were sustaining serious eye damage during what their parents believed was responsible preventative medical treatment recommended by a licensed physician. 56. In the 1950s, American families loading up the car for a road trip thought nothing of placing their baby inside a wicker bassinet, strapping the bassinet loosely to the back seat with whatever belts or ropes were available, and driving at highway speeds for hours. The bassinet provided the baby a comfortable place to sleep during the journey, and that felt like enough. In any collision scenario, the bassinet would become a projectile. The baby would become a projectile inside the projectile, and the outcome was not survivable at highway speeds. Crash testing of these arrangements was never conducted because the concept of crash testing baby travel products had not yet occurred to anyone in a position to require it. 57. Our monkey bars were installed on school playgrounds across America throughout the 20th century, and the surface underneath them was bare concrete, because that was simply what playgrounds were built on, and nobody had questioned it. Children fell from monkey bars constantly because children always fall from monkey bars. That is a fundamental truth of childhood. Falling from height onto bare concrete causes serious fractures, head injuries, and concussions in ways that falling onto a cushioned surface does not. Safety surfacing guidelines for playgrounds suggesting rubber mulch, wood chips, or impact-absorbing materials did not emerge until the 1970s and took decades more to become genuinely standard practice in American schools. 58. Victorian-era doctors had a specific procedure they performed on teething infants who seemed to be struggling with the discomfort of emerging teeth, and that procedure involved taking a small, sharp surgical lancet and cutting directly through the gum tissue above the emerging tooth to help it break through faster. The logic seemed reasonable by the medical standards of the time. The results were frequently catastrophic. The infant's mouth is not a sterile environment, and cutting through gum tissue with instruments that were not properly sterilized introduced bacteria directly into the wound. Infections spread rapidly in infants with immature immune systems, and what began as a routine teething procedure ended in fatal sepsis with disturbing regularity. 59. The kids. Two-rocking sleeper entered the American market looking like exactly the kind of soothing, gentle product that exhausted new parents desperately want to believe in. It rocked, it vibrated, it held the baby at a slight incline, and it promised better sleep for everyone in the household. The inclined sleeping position it placed infants in was dangerous for babies without sufficient muscle control to maintain their airway during sleep. Infant deaths were reported and documented. The product was recalled in 2019 as part of a broader wave of regulatory action against inclined infant sleepers that the Consumer Product Safety Commission finally pursued after years of mounting evidence that the entire product category was killing babies. 60. And the Fisher-Price Rock and Play Sleeper was one of the best-selling infant products in American retail history, and parents absolutely loved it because babies slept in it, and getting a baby to sleep felt like winning. The seat held infants at a 30-degree incline, which pediatric sleep guidelines clearly state is unsafe for unsupervised infant sleep. Over 90 infant deaths were eventually linked to the Rock and Play before Fisher-Price recalled it in 2019. The product had been on the market for a decade. It had won parenting awards. Pediatricians had raised concerns for years, and the company kept selling it until congressional pressure and media attention made continued sales impossible to defend publicly. 61. Out of Bonington's Irish Moss was sold in early 1900s. Pharmacies as a perfectly respectable children's cough syrup, and mothers bought it without hesitation because it had a professional-sounding name and a clean label. The active ingredient was heroin, not a heroin derivative, not a mild opiate. Actual heroin, listed openly in the formula. Children received doses for common coughs and colds while parents felt responsible for treating their sick kid promptly. Nobody at the pharmacy counter thought this required any special warning or age restriction whatsoever. 62. Baby clothing manufacturers in the early 20th century discovered that treating fabric with formaldehyde kept garments wrinkle-free during shipping and storage, and that felt like a genuine innovation worth using everywhere. A formaldehyde-treated fabric releases gas slowly over time, and infant skin absorbs it directly during prolonged contact. Babies wore these treated garments against their skin all day and slept in them all night. Skin irritation, respiratory irritation, and chemical absorption were the results of dressing an infant in what the label simply described as easy care, permanently pressed and ready-to-wear clothing. 63. Before pasteurization became standard practice in the early 20th century. Raw, unpasteurized cow's milk was what American and European families gave their infants when breastfeeding was not possible. Raw cow's milk carried bovine tuberculosis, a bacterial infection that transferred efficiently from cattle to human infants through direct consumption. So infant mortality from tuberculosis transmitted through milk was staggering across the entire industrialized world for generations. Pasteurization existed as a proven solution for years before it became widely adopted because dairy farmers resisted it aggressively and regulators moved slowly against a powerful agricultural industry. 64. Metal buckle baby shoes were standard footwear for infants across America well into the 20th century, and they were designed and manufactured with sharp stamped metal edges on the buckle hardware that pressed directly against infant foot skin. Babies who were not yet walking wore these shoes purely for appearance, and the buckles created pressure sores on soft infant skin during hours of wear. Parents dressed their babies in painful shoes daily because shoes on a baby looked adorable in photographs, and social expectation around infant appearance consistently outweighed any concern about whether the baby found the experience comfortable. 65. Stroller folding mechanisms became a major consumer safety disaster in the late 20th century, when millions of units were recalled after a deeply unfortunate design flaw became impossible to ignore. The hinges that allowed the stroller frame to collapse for storage created powerful pinch points that had no guards or protective covers over them. Parents folding the stroller after an outing and children reaching toward the moving frame both experienced the same result. The hinge closed on fingers with significant mechanical force, and in numerous documented cases, the force was sufficient to completely sever fingertips from the hands of small children. 66. Wooden toy chests were a nursery staple in American homes for most of the 20th century, and they were built as simple sealed boxes with heavy lids and no ventilation holes because they were designed to store toys, not to consider what happened when a child climbed inside one. Children climbed inside them constantly because children climb into everything. The heavy lid would fall shut and latch or simply rest on the child's neck. No air circulation meant the oxygen depleted rapidly inside the sealed box. Multiple children suffocated in their own toy chests before lid support hinges, and ventilation holes became required design features. 67. In 2007, a CSI-themed fingerprint examination kit was sold in toy stores across America, targeting children who wanted to play detective and examine crime scenes just like on television. The fingerprint dusting powder included in the kit contained asbestos-contaminated tremolite, a form of asbestos fiber that causes mesothelioma. Children were blowing fingerprint powder across surfaces, inhaling the dust clouds enthusiastically, and receiving direct asbestos fiber exposure during what was supposed to be imaginative educational play. The kit was recalled, but not before significant numbers had already been sold, opened, and actively used by children in homes nationwide. 68. Rubber-soled toddler sandals and the modern escalator turned out to be a genuinely catastrophic combination that nobody anticipated when escalators became standard fixtures in American malls and department stores. The soft, flexible rubber of toddler footwear was precisely the wrong material to wear near escalator teeth, because it compressed and caught in the mechanism at the point where the step disappeared into the floor plate. Children's toes and feet were pulled into the escalator machinery with degloving injuries resulting, meaning the skin was stripped away from the underlying tissue. Multiple children required surgical intervention before escalator design standards were updated to address the hazard. 69. And in the 1940s and 1950s, premature infants in American hospital NICUs were placed inside oxygen tents that maintained a pure oxygen environment, because doctors believed maximum oxygen exposure would help fragile premature babies survive and develop. The logic seemed sound. The outcome was devastating. Pure oxygen at sustained high concentrations causes retinal damage in premature infants whose eyes are still developing. Thousands of premature babies who survived their early birth thanks to oxygen tent treatment grew up with permanent partial or total blindness, caused directly by the medical intervention that saved their lives. The connection took years of research to establish definitively. 70. The giant stride maypole was a playground fixture in American schools for decades, and the activity involved children grabbing rope handles attached to a central spinning pole and running in a circle until they lifted off the ground and flew outward. It sounds fun because it was fun right up until it wasn't. Multiple children holding ropes on the same pole meant the ropes tangled during enthusiastic spinning sessions. Tangled ropes meant children were pulled together, knocked down, and in documented cases, the ropes wrapped around necks during falls. Schools kept these structures up for years, treating injuries as an acceptable cost of outdoor recreation. 71. Swaddling in medieval and early modern Europe went far beyond the gentle wrapping practiced today, and infants were bound head to toe in long strips of linen bandaging so tightly that no limb movement was physically possible and kept that way for months at a time. Mothers were told this would ensure the baby grew straight and developed properly shaped limbs. What it actually produced was severe muscle atrophy from complete immobilization during the most critical period of physical development. Babies who spent their first months entirely motionless emerged with weakened muscles and joint deformities that stayed with them permanently. 72. The summer infant swaddle me. By your side. Sleeper was designed to sit inside a parent's bed and give the infant their own padded sleeping space during nighttime feeding and co-sleeping. It looked safe because it had padded walls and a defined sleeping area which gave parents genuine confidence. And those soft padded walls were precisely the problem. An infant who rolled or shifted toward the padded side had their face pressed against soft compressible material with no firm surface to push against. 8 infant suffocation deaths were linked to the product before Summer Infant recalled it. In 2019, under regulatory pressure. 73. In 1970s, neonatal intensive care units, premature babies who needed warmth were sometimes placed on heated water mattresses that circulated warm water beneath the infant to maintain body temperature. The concept was medically sound, but the execution was dangerously flawed because these early devices had no reliable temperature regulation mechanism. The water temperature could rise unchecked while the infant lay directly on top of the mattress surface, unable to move away from the heat source. Burn injuries on premature infants, already among the most vulnerable patients in any hospital, were documented at multiple facilities before better regulated warming systems replaced the water mattress approach. 74. Original gripe water formulas sold throughout the 19th and early 20th century in Britain and America contained alcohol concentrations of up to 9%, which is comparable to a light beer, and this mixture was given routinely to colicky newborns to calm their digestive distress. Parents measured out doses for babies who were days or weeks old without any awareness that they were administering alcohol to an infant liver, completely incapable of processing it safely. I.e., the babies quieted down after receiving their gripe water dose, and everyone assumed the colic had been relieved, rather than considering that the infant was simply intoxicated. 75. Celluloid was the miracle plastic material of the late 19th and early 20th century, and manufacturers used it enthusiastically for children's hair accessories, including combs, clips, and decorative barrettes worn by girls daily. Celluloid is made from nitrocellulose, which is chemically related to gun cotton and is extraordinarily flammable. Static electricity generated by combing hair was sufficient to ignite celluloid accessories under the right conditions. A girl combing her hair near any heat source, including a candle or gas lamp, risked her hair accessories catching fire instantly. The same material causing fires in toy rattles was sitting directly on children's heads every single morning. 76. Borax was added to commercial baby food products in the early 1900s as a preservative that extended shelf life and prevented spoilage during distribution and storage. Food manufacturers used it freely because preservation technology was limited, and spoiled baby food was a genuine commercial problem they needed to solve. Borax causes kidney damage with regular consumption, and infants consuming borax-preserved food daily were receiving consistent doses of a substance their developing kidneys were entirely unequipped to process safely. The practice continued for years because baby food looked fine, smelled fine, and the kidney damage it was causing developed slowly and invisibly. 77. Ribbon-tied baby bonnets were considered essential infant accessories throughout the Victorian era and well into the 20th century, and the longer and more elaborately tied the ribbon, the more carefully dressed the baby appeared to onlookers. Those long decorative ribbon ties sat directly under the infant's chin and draped loosely around the neck area during wear. An infant moving during sleep or becoming tangled in bedding could twist those ribbons into a configuration that tightened around the neck without any adult nearby noticing. The bonnet looked precious in portraits, and that aesthetic priority consistently overrode any practical consideration of what long fabric ties near an infant neck actually meant. 78. What wire mesh-sided baby prams were sold in the early 20th century as a ventilated modern alternative to solid-sided carriages, and the open wire construction was marketed as providing superior fresh air circulation for the infant inside. What the wire mesh sides actually provided was zero padding against impact, zero insulation against cold temperatures, and zero protection against rain, wind, or direct sun exposure. The baby lay inside a wire box being pushed through whatever weather existed that day with nothing between them and the elements except the wire grid itself. Parents bought these prams because ventilation sounded scientifically progressive, and nobody questioned what ventilation actually meant for a baby in February. 79. Baby monitor power cords in the 1980s and 1990s were long enough to reach from a wall outlet to wherever the monitor unit sat near the crib, and that cord draped loosely through the crib space without anyone identifying it as a strangulation hazard. Infants moving during sleep encountered the cord, grabbed it, and in documented cases became wrapped in it around the neck during nighttime hours when no adult was watching. Death by strangulation on a baby monitor cord, a device purchased specifically to keep the baby safer, was a recorded cause of infant death for years before cordless monitor technology became the standard product design. 80. The Snack Time Cabbage Patch Doll, released in 1996, had a motorized mouth mechanism designed to chew plastic food accessories, and the feature worked exactly as designed, which was entirely the problem. The chewing motor had no automatic shutoff and no pressure sensor to detect when something other than plastic food entered the mouth. Children playing with the doll lost hair when the mechanism grabbed it and pulled it into the chewing motor. Fingers placed near the mouth were pulled in with enough force to cause injury. Mattel received over 500 complaints and recalled the doll within months of release, but not before it had been a celebrated holiday bestseller. 81. Baby wading pools became a backyard staple for American families in the 1960s and 1970s, and parents filled them up on hot days and then went inside to answer the phone or start dinner without draining them first. A toddler left alone in a yard with a filled wading pool had access to enough water to drown in without making enough noise for anyone inside the house to hear. Drowning in 6 inches of water takes very little time and happens completely silently. No laws required parents to drain portable pools after use, and no warnings on the packaging suggested that 6 inches of water was genuinely dangerous to a small child. 82. Some 18th century midwives practiced deliberate skull shaping on newborn infants, using their hands and various tools to mold the soft cranial bones in the hours and days immediately after birth. Now, the infant's skull is genuinely malleable at birth, which was understood, but the interventions being performed went far beyond gentle repositioning. Pressing, binding, and reshaping tools applied to a newborn skull with any significant force risked compressing brain tissue and disrupting normal cranial development. Infants subjected to aggressive skull-shaping procedures sustained brain damage from what their caregivers genuinely believed was skilled professional attention to producing a properly shaped and presentable head. 83. Seesaws on American playgrounds operated on a simple and obvious mechanical principle, where the fun depended entirely on both children cooperating and neither one jumping off unexpectedly. The person on the ground end of a saw when the other child jumped off, received the full weight of the board crashing down onto the ground with their body still attached to it. The impact traveled directly up the spine. Spinal compression injuries from seesaw drops were common enough to be a recognized pediatric complaint for decades. A rubber bumper at the center pivot point that limited the crash distance was an obvious solution that took an extraordinarily long time to become standard equipment. 84. 18th century medical advice for colicky infants included a recommendation that gained genuine traction among physicians and parents across Europe and America, which was to plunge the screaming baby into a cold water bath to shock their nervous system into calmness. Doctors wrote this into published guidance with complete professional confidence. Parents dunked their colicky infants into cold water repeatedly following medical instructions they had no reason to question. Cold water immersion in newborns causes rapid core temperature drop, cardiovascular stress, and shock responses in infant bodies completely unprepared for sudden temperature change. The babies sometimes stopped crying, which everyone interpreted as the treatment working successfully. 85. The Boppy Newborn Lounger was one of those products that looked so soft, so gentle, and so obviously comfortable that millions of American parents used it constantly for unsupervised infant rest without a second thought. The lounger cradled the baby in a slightly curved position that felt supportive, but created a positional risk for infants without muscle control to maintain their own airway. 8 infant deaths linked to positional suffocation in the Boppy Newborn Lounger were reported before the Consumer Product Safety Commission pushed for its recall in 2021. The product had been a bestseller and a baby shower staple for years before those deaths prompted any regulatory action. 86. Beanbag chairs enjoyed a surge of popularity in American homes during the 1970s, and someone decided they would make excellent infant seats because they were soft, moldable, and conformed comfortably to any body shape placed on them. That exact quality made them immediately dangerous for infants. A baby placed on a beanbag compressed the filling beneath their weight, and the bag material shifted upward around the sides of their face, creating a soft, suffocating enclosure. The infant lacked the strength to push away from the conforming surface. Beanbag. Infant seats were banned in the United States in 1976, after multiple infant suffocation deaths made the design flaw impossible to overlook. 87. Dr. Moffat's Teethina was a teething powder sold across America and Britain in the late 19th and early 20th century that was marketed with cheerful packaging and confident health claims as a completely safe and effective solution for teething discomfort in infants. The active ingredient was mercury. Parents dusted it onto their baby's gums regularly following the dosing instructions on the package because a doctor's name was on the label, and that felt like sufficient endorsement. Mercury accumulates in the body with each exposure. Infants receiving regular Teethina applications were building up mercury loads that caused the constellation of symptoms doctors of the era called pink disease without identifying the cause sitting in their own medicine cabinets. 88. Rubber teething rings were handed to gnawing infants for generations as a safe and simple solution for teething discomfort, and parents never had reason to question what the rubber itself was made of or what it released during prolonged chewing. Certain rubber manufacturing processes use nitrosamines as part of the vulcanization chemistry, and nitrosamines are potent carcinogens that transfer from the rubber surface into saliva during chewing contact. Infants chewing rubber teething rings for hours daily were receiving consistent carcinogen exposure through the exact product given to them, specifically because chewing on it was the intended and encouraged use. The packaging said teething ring, and that felt like a complete safety guarantee. 89. Weaning infants onto bread soaked in beer was a completely standard and widely recommended practice across Europe through the 18th century, and parents followed it without hesitation because physicians endorsed it and tradition supported it. Now, beer was considered safer than water in many regions because waterborne illness was a genuine daily threat, and that logic was not entirely wrong. What it meant in practice was that infants transitioning off breast milk were consuming alcohol daily through their first solid food experiences. Infant livers are not equipped to metabolize alcohol. The babies who seemed sleepy and content after their beer-bread meals were showing early signs of alcohol toxicity that everyone around them mistook for healthy satisfaction. 90. Baby sun hats in the 19th and early 20th century were tied under the infant's chin, with long decorative fabric ties because keeping the hat securely on a baby's head during outdoor outings was a practical necessity, and ties seemed like the obvious solution. Those long chin ties presented an obvious strangulation risk during sleep if a baby was placed down for a nap still wearing their outdoor hat. The ties could also catch on pram fixtures and carriage hardware during travel, pulling tight against the infant's neck with the movement of the vehicle. The hats looked charming and kept the sun off, which were the only two criteria anyone evaluated them against. 91. Wheeled baby go-karts were a popular outdoor toy for American toddlers in the 1920s, and parents loved watching their small children pedal and roll around the neighborhood independently. The vehicles had no brakes of any functional kind and no steering mechanism sophisticated enough to help a toddler navigate anything beyond a perfectly flat surface. Streets in residential neighborhoods were not perfectly flat, and traffic was increasing rapidly as automobile ownership expanded across America. Toddlers in go-karts rolled freely into intersections and driveways, with no ability to stop themselves and no adult fast enough to catch a wheeled child already moving downhill toward traffic. 92. Window blind looped cords were a fixture in virtually every American home for decades, and the Consumer Product Safety Commission documented that a child was dying from blind cord strangulation approximately once every month for an extended period. The loop formed by the pull cord on standard horizontal blinds created a fixed noose at a height that corresponded almost exactly with the neck level of a standing toddler. Soft children playing near windows encountered the loop and became entangled faster than any adult could intervene. The blinds industry resisted mandatory redesign requirements for years, while the monthly death toll continued and safety advocates fought for regulatory action that took far too long to arrive. 93. Aqua dots were a wildly popular craft toy sold in American stores in 2007 that allowed children to arrange small, colorful beads into patterns and then spray them with water to fuse them together into a finished design. The coating on the beads that activated with water happened to metabolize inside the human body into gamma-hydroxybutyrate, which is the chemical compound known on the street as the date rape drug. Children who swallowed the beads, which children reliably do with small objects, fell into seizures and drug-induced unconsciousness. The toy was pulled in a mass recall but had already been named a top holiday gift of the year before the chemistry problem was discovered. 94. Mustard plasters were a standard home remedy across America and Europe for chest congestion and respiratory illness, and adults used them routinely on themselves with reasonable results. The problem emerged when parents began applying the same caustic paste directly onto the chest skin of newborn infants following the same logic. Mustard plaster creates a significant burning sensation on adult skin with prolonged contact. On newborn skin, which is dramatically thinner and more permeable than adult skin, the same plaster caused severe chemical burns that blistered and damaged tissue. Infants screamed during the application, which parents interpreted as the treatment working rather than as the baby communicating that their skin was being burned. 95. Baby farming in Victorian England was a paid childcare arrangement where women accepted infants from mothers who could not care for them in exchange for a weekly fee. And the transaction seemed like a reasonable private solution to a genuine social problem. In practice, many baby farmers had no interest in keeping the infants alive beyond the initial payment period. Mortality rates in documented baby farming operations exceeded 90% in the worst recorded cases. Infants were starved, drugged with opiates, and left without adequate care in overcrowded conditions. Several baby farmers were eventually prosecuted for murder, but the practice continued largely unregulated for decades because nobody was monitoring what happened to the babies after the feed changed hands. 96. Canopy cribs were a fashionable nursery choice for middle and upper-class American and European families well into the 20th century because the draped fabric canopy above the sleeping infant looked undeniably beautiful and created a sense of luxury in the nursery. The decorative fabric was attached to a frame above the crib and draped down around the sleeping area in loose, elegant folds. Fabric that is loosely attached above a sleeping infant can fall. Fallen fabric lands on the infant's face. An infant does not have the strength or coordination to push heavy draped fabric away from their airway. Suffocation deaths linked to decorative crib canopies were documented repeatedly before the design fell out of medical favor. 97. Paregoric elixir was available over the counter in American pharmacies well into the 1970s and was routinely recommended for infant diarrhea and teething discomfort by physicians and pharmacists who had been trained to view it as a standard and reliable treatment. Paregoric is camphorated opium tincture, meaning its active ingredient is opium. Parents measured it out for their infants at home following label instructions and gave it for common everyday complaints that any infant experiences during normal development. Opiate dependency can develop with repeated exposure even in adults. Or infants receiving regular paregoric doses for routine teething discomfort were being given an addictive narcotic by parents who believed they were simply following good medical advice. 98. Modeling clay sets sold to American children in the 1950s and 1960s were a completely standard creative toy found in classrooms and homes everywhere, and the clay compound itself was considered inert and obviously safe because it was soft and colorful and made for children. Some formulations of these modeling compounds contained chrysotile asbestos fibers mixed into the clay material as a texturizing agent. Children handling the clay, pulling it apart, rolling it, and playing with it for hours were generating asbestos fiber dust with their hands during normal creative play. Nobody knew because the packaging said modeling clay for children, and that description seemed like a complete account of what was inside the container. 99. Pap boats were ceramic feeding vessels used across Europe and America for centuries to deliver PAP to infants who were not being breastfed, and pap was a mixture of flour or bread crumbled into water or milk that was considered a perfectly adequate breast milk substitute by the medical standards of every era in which it was used. Flour paste has almost none of the proteins, fats, antibodies, or nutritional complexity that infant bodies require for development. Infants fed exclusively on PAP developed scurvy, rickets, severe malnutrition, and immune deficiency. PAP-fed babies died at dramatically higher rates than breastfed babies, and physicians attributed the deaths to infant weakness rather than to the nutritionally empty paste they were prescribing. 100. Electric vibrating cradles were marketed in the 1920s as a modern technological solution for soothing fussy infants, and the combination of gentle vibration and rocking motion did genuinely help babies settle, which made the product popular among American families eager for any sleep solution. The electrical wiring inside these early cradles reflected 1920s construction standards, which meant uninsulated or poorly insulated cords running through and beneath a wooden cradle frame directly under a sleeping infant. Electrical fires started by faulty wiring in infant cradles were documented. Shock risks from exposed conductors near a baby lying on a damp surface after a feeding were entirely unaddressed because electrical safety standards for infant products did not yet exist in any meaningful form. 101. Sky Dancers were spring-launched flying fairy dolls sold in American toy stores throughout the late 1990s, and children absolutely loved them because you pulled a ripcord and the doll spun up into the air unpredictably, which felt magical and exciting. The unpredictable part was the genuine problem. The dolls launched in random directions at significant speed and struck children in the face, eyes, and teeth with enough force to cause lacerations, broken teeth, and serious eye injuries, including reported cases of temporary blindness. Galoob received over 150 complaints before the Consumer Product Safety Commission recalled Sky Dancers in the year 2000. 102. Baby steam inhalers were used in American homes throughout the 19th and early 20th century, as a treatment for croup and respiratory congestion in infants, because steam therapy genuinely helped open airways, and physicians recommended it confidently. The devices worked by heating a water reservoir until it produced a steady steam output directed toward the baby. The reservoir contained boiling water and had no automatic shutoff mechanism, and no temperature-limiting feature of any kind. Parents fell asleep during nighttime treatments. The water continued heating. Infants positioned near the device sustained scalding burns from steam and from direct contact with surfaces that had reached dangerous temperatures while everyone slept. 103. Before germ theory transformed medical understanding in the late 19th century. Wet nursing was common practice for infants whose mothers could not breastfeed, and families hired wet nurses based on their appearance, reputation, and milk supply without any medical screening whatsoever. A wet nurse carrying syphilis, tuberculosis, or typhoid fever transmitted those infections directly to the nursing infant through breast milk and close physical contact during every feeding. Infants contracted serious infectious diseases from their caregivers without anyone understanding the transmission mechanism. Saw families watch their babies sicken and died without connecting the illness to the woman they had hired, specifically to nourish and care for their child. 104. Combination crib and changing dresser units were sold to American parents as space-saving nursery furniture solutions, and the integrated changing surface that folded out from the dresser top seemed like an elegant, practical design. The drop-leaf changing surface was attached to the dresser frame with hinges and hardware that had not been tested under the dynamic weight load of a squirming infant during an active diaper change. The leaf collapsed under baby weight during routine use. Infants fell with the collapsing surface from dresser height onto nursery floors. The product reached store shelves in family homes without any safety testing protocol that would have identified this completely predictable structural failure before it injured real babies. 105. Clackers were one of the most popular toys in American schools and playgrounds in the early 1970s, and the concept was simple: two heavy acrylic balls connected by a string that you swung up and down until they clacked together above and below your hand in a satisfying rhythm. The acrylic material used in early production versions was not impact rated for the repeated high-velocity collisions the toy was designed to produce. The balls shattered during use and sent razor-sharp acrylic fragments in all directions at face level. Eye injuries, facial lacerations, and wrist injuries from the impact were reported widely enough that the Consumer Product Safety Commission investigated and effectively pulled them from shelves. 106. Fontanelle pressing was practiced by some 18th century midwives who believed that the soft spot on a newborn's skull represented an opportunity to influence the shape and development of the infant's head during the brief window when the cranial bones remained unfused and malleable. Tools and hand pressure were applied directly to the fontanelle area with the intention of producing what the midwife considered a properly proportioned infant head. The fontanelle exists directly over brain tissue with no bony protection. Pressure applied to that area transmitted force directly onto the brain of a newborn. Brain damage resulting from fontanelle manipulation was undetectable by the standards of 18th century medicine and went entirely unrecognized as a consequence of the procedure. 107. The Hannah Montana Popstar card game was released in 2008, targeting the enormous market of young American girls who were devoted fans of the television show. And the merchandise seemed like a completely safe and obvious product, a card game themed around a beloved children's entertainer. The cards themselves had been manufactured with edges sharp enough to cause deep lacerations on the hands and fingers of children handling them during normal gameplay. Children were cutting themselves on a card game. The product was recalled almost immediately after reaching stores, but the combination of a massively popular brand and a fundamentally dangerous physical product had already resulted in injuries before anyone caught the manufacturing defect. 108. Cap guns have been a beloved American childhood toy for generations, and the satisfying bang they produced made them enormously popular with children who wanted to play cowboys and soldiers in their backyards. Early versions of cap guns used actual gunpowder-based percussion caps that produced a genuinely explosive report rather than the mild pop of later paper cap versions. The explosive force was sufficient to cause burns on fingers and palms when the gun was held incorrectly during firing. The noise level produced by early cap gun discharge was loud enough to cause permanent hearing damage with repeated close exposure. These were toys designed for children with no hearing protection recommended or provided. 109. Giving infants alcohol to stop crying was not considered neglect or abuse. Across Europe and America throughout the entire 19th century, it was considered practical household management, and the advice passed freely between mothers, grandmothers, and family doctors without hesitation. A small amount of whiskey rubbed on the gums, a spoonful of brandy mixed into warm water, a drop of gin on the tongue. Babies receiving alcohol stopped crying quickly, which confirmed to everyone present that the remedy worked exactly as intended. The infant liver has virtually no capacity to metabolize alcohol safely. What looked like a calmed baby was frequently an infant in the early stages of alcohol toxicity-induced unconsciousness. 110. Magnetics were colorful magnetic building sets sold in American toy stores in the early 2000s that allowed children to construct geometric shapes and structures using steel rods and magnetic balls. And the product looked like exactly the kind of creative educational toy that responsible parents bought for smart, curious kids. The magnetic balls were small enough to swallow, and when a child swallowed more than one, they did not pass through the digestive system independently. The magnets attracted each other through intestinal walls and pinched the tissue between them, causing perforations. Children required emergency surgery, though multiple deaths were reported before a recall was issued in 2006, and the product category faced serious regulatory reform. 111. Before modern vacuum-sealed lids with the safety button indicator became standard in the baby food industry, jars of commercially produced infant food in the early 20th century had no reliable visible indication of whether the seal had failed and the contents had spoiled or become contaminated. Parents opened jars that looked perfectly normal, smelled mostly acceptable, and fed the contents to their infants with complete confidence in the product they had purchased from a reputable manufacturer. Clostridium botulinum produces no visible changes in contaminated food and generates no obvious odor, so infant botulism. Outbreaks traced to commercially jarred baby food occurred repeatedly before vacuum seal technology, and the iconic safety button lid made contamination visible to anyone who looked. So next time you think modern parenting is hard, just remember people were literally feeding babies morphine, strapping them to windows 6 stories up, and handing toddlers uranium kits for Christmas. We did not get worse at parenting. We just finally got smart enough to read the label. Drop a comment telling us which invention absolutely broke your brain. Hit like, subscribe to Dumb History, and share this with someone who needs a reality check about how terrifying the good old days actually were. Click one of those videos on screen right now because, trust us, it only gets weirder from here.